I was part of a U.S. Air Force cover-up for 17 years. I was officer in charge of photo-optical instrumentation at Vandenberg Air Force Base from 1963 to 66. And during that time, I was in charge of a 100-man unit that was responsible for providing engineering and sequential photography for every single launch from that Western Test Range, which was at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Our duty was to provide coverage of every launch, because back in those days, 1963, 64, many of the missiles blew up on the pad. And the engineers at Boeing and Douglas and other outfits who were building these missiles needed to know what was happening, what took place frame by frame, second by second, in fact, millisecond by millisecond. We'd have about 30 cameras set up on every single launch. We'd have 3 tracking sites to provide triangulation for the things. And one day I got a call from my Major Florence J. Mansmann, who was the optical instrumentation officer at 1st Strategic Air Base Air Command. He called me into his office and said, "Bob, have you ever been up to Big Sur?" And I said, "Well, when in my college days, I was a beatnik, and I remembered Lawrence Ferlinghetti speaking his poems at the Nepenthe Cafe in Big Sur." So, "Yeah, I've been up there." He said, "Well, I want you to go up there, and there's a Forest Service station on Anderson Peak. I want you to go up there and just take a look around and see if it's possible for us to get a line of sight from Big Sur back down to Vandenberg." I said, "Okay." I hopped in my station wagon and drove up to Big Sur. I met the Forest Service officer there, and he took me up to the Forest Service Road, which you can see here. And we found a place where a prearranged time a missile was launched, and I managed to look down the coast about 160 miles. And yes, we could see the thing from the side. The point was that the engineers wanted to see what was going on from the side view of these missiles. From our positions on Vandenberg, all we could do is look up the tailpipe. So we took a tracking mount up there and photographed with our little cameras a couple of launches. And sure enough, the engineers were excited to see the side view. Next thing that happened is, after I'd established this site, Major Mansmann called me and said, "I want you to go back up to the site. We're sending something up for you." So I drove back up to Vandenberg, to Big Sur, and suddenly this huge truck came pulling up the Forest Service Road. It was towing a massive telescope, a catadioptric telescope, with a potential focal length of 2,400 inches. I'm sure you photographers in the crowd will know that 25 millimeters for a 60 millimeter camera is, or a 1-inch lens is normal. Imagine a 2,000 inch telescope. That's it that you're seeing on the screen right now. We set this telescope up and did a couple of tests with it, and then something magical happened, something that changed my view of the universe and our position in it. On September 14th, 1964, there was a launch of an Atlas D missile from Vandenberg, and this group that you see here in front, I'm the guy wearing the MG jacket. We were told to wear civilian clothes up there so we didn't get the natives riled up. There was an early morning fog bank. As we looked down the coast toward Vandenberg, suddenly this missile popped out and it flew downrange beautifully against the clear sky. We couldn't see what the telescope was seeing. So I need to explain to you why we missed it on the site. This telescope had an image orthicon tube, which was attached to the telescope. So the signal went from the telescope into the image orthicon tube, and a 35 millimeter Mitchell camera was established shooting a picture of the surface of the image orthicon tube. It was called kinescope recording, for those of you old enough to remember kinescope recording from the old days of TV. So it was covered with a black shield, and we couldn't see what was in there. Anyhow, we watched this missile go until it went out of our sight, but the 2,000 inch telescope, which at that point had about a focal length of 1,000 inches, locked down on it. We were radar tracking it, locked down on what was in. We couldn't see what was in it. But we were all celebrating, jumping up and down, saying, "Yeah, we got it. The engineers are going to be so happy." And the folks from from BU who brought the telescope out to us for happy. And everything settled down. I went back to Vandenberg. 2 days later, I was called by Major Mansmann. He said, Lieutenant Jacobs, I want you to come to my office right away. When a major tells you to do something and you're a lieutenant, you do it. So I hustled over to First Strategic Air headquarters. I walked into Major Mansmann's office, and I'll describe for you what I saw. There was a table set up in his office, and on the table was a 16 millimeter projector. There was a daylight screen on the wall adjacent to it. There were two men in gray flannel suits. There was Major Mansmann and his office over here, and here was the screen. Major Mansmann said, Lieutenant, sit down. And I did. And he said, now watch this. He turned the projector on, and the most amazing thing happened. We could see the bottom three stages of that rocket filling the frame from 160 miles away. It was amazing. The clarity was beautiful, and that thing took off, and we watched it go through all three stages of powered flight, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and then we saw, incredibly, at a long distance, the thing was now heading for Kwajalein. And the nose cone opened up, and radar chaff, essentially aluminum foil, spread out in front of it. Here's what the function of the aluminum foil was. We were testing to see if we could launch a nuclear warhead into an orbit slightly above the nuclear chaff so that the Russians would aim their anti-missile missiles at the chaff, and our little warhead would go spoop like this and fly over and obliterate Moscow. That's the game we were playing. It was horrifying to think about in retrospect. Anyhow, as the thing was flying along, we saw the warhead eject in over the chaff, and it was flying along. We're going about 8,000 miles an hour now. And suddenly, from in the frame, we saw an object come in from the same way we were going, 8,000 miles. This object flew in. I'm trying to do something here on the screen so you can see. The object flew in. It came up to our warhead. It went around the top of the warhead, fired a beam of light down onto the top of the warhead, went around to the front of the warhead. Man, we're all traveling at about 8,000 miles an hour here. Fired another beam of light, went down below the warhead, fired another beam of light, went around the way it had come in, fired another beam of light, and then flew out of the frame the same way it had come in. At that point, the warhead tumbled out of space. Let me tell you what happened next. Just to say it. The lights came on. Major Mansmann looked at me. The two guys in gray suits looked at me. And Major Mansmann said, were you guys screwing around up there? And I said, no, sir. He said, then what was that? I said, it looks to me like we got a UFO. Major Mansmann said, you are never to say that again. As far as you're concerned, this didn't happen. He said, you understand? I said, yes, sir. He escorted me to his door to his office, and he said, now, I don't need to remind you of the seriousness of a security breach, do I? I said, no, sir. He said, all right, then you're dismissed. But as I left, as I was prepared to leave, he leaned over to speak into my ear to say something that the guys in the suits couldn't see. He said, Lieutenant, if you were ever tortured in the future, somebody has you up against the wall and they're frying your privates with fire, he said, you can tell them this, just to get out of it. Just tell them, oh, it was laser tracking. We didn't have laser tracking in 1964. For 17 years, I shut up. I never said anything to anybody. And then one night, I was doing a late night talk show in Eureka, California, on station KFMI. And the topic of UFOs came up, and I had been muddling with this thing in my mind, because here's what happens, folks. You see something that's totally inexplicable. How in the heck could this thing, and it was, by the way, a flying saucer. It was shaped like a saucer, like a ping pong ball on top, and it was firing a beam of light at our warheads. How could such a thing happen? How could a guy from Compton, California, who'd gone to USC and played a little football and worked for Walt Disney and so on, suddenly have his world shaken up by discovering that we are not alone, that thing was up there, that I saw it. It was on film. And by the way, I'm still alive, barely. When it happened to me, my world changed, my worldview changed, but I was under orders to shut up, so I shut up. Part of UFO, U.S. Air Force cover-up, in fact.
Major Mansmann responded to, I think this was a journalist that wanted more information about this incident, and Major Mansmann did support Dr. Jacobs in these letters, and I'll just read a little bit here. We knew the missile nose cone size, but could not compare since did not know how far from the missile the object was from the missile at the time of the beam release. The shape was classic disc. The center seemed to be raised, bubble. Not sure any ports or slits could be seen, but was stationary or moving slightly, floating over the entire lower saucer shape, which was glowing and seemed to be rotating slowly at the point of beam release. Okay, Dr. Jacobs, any final words?
No. I could tell a couple of tales about the further cover-up. Let me just talk, because it's kind of funny. One of the researchers who contacted me was Lee Graham, who worked for one of the missile manufacturing companies in Los Angeles. He was quite interested in UFOs. He pursued the thing throughout his lifetime. So he contacted me, and I told him my story, and then he went to verify what I had told him. He contacted the Air Force to inquire about Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs. They told him there was no such Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs, nor had there ever been. He went to Vandenberg. He said he asked them if there had been a Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs as officer in charge of optical instrumentation in the 1369 Photo Squadron. He was told no such officer ever existed. He pursued his research. He wondered if there had been a missile launch on September 14th, 1964. He was told there was no such missile launch ever taking place. We continued his investigation, and finally the Air Force had to admit that, well, yes, there had been a Lieutenant Robert M. Jacobs, and yes, he was officer in charge of photo-optical instrumentation at Vandenberg, and yes, there was a missile launch on the date in question. When Lee filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get a copy of the film, he was told no such film existed. And let me verify that it probably doesn't, because there's been some controversy over whether I'm telling the truth, whether Major Mansmann is telling the truth, and I assure you that we are. He did. He is passed on, unfortunately. And what we know is that the two guys in gray suits who were in Major Mansmann's office that day were with one of the government agencies that are all alphabetized. We believe it was the CIA. They took the reel of film from Major Mansmann, they reeled it down, and they snipped off the bit of the film that had the encounter on it. They gave Major Mansmann back the rest of the film, and they said to him, "We don't need to remind you of a security breach, do we?" He said, "No, sir." And they walked out of his office with the film in hand. Major Mansmann reported how many people had seen the film. And here's who he reported saw it. He saw it. The commanding officer saw it. The chief scientist saw it. I saw it. And one other person saw it. Those are the only people who saw this film. There was a man named Kingston George who was involved in the thing as an engineer with one of the missile companies. He did not see the same film that Major Mansmann and I saw. That bit of film went off to God knows wherever the CIA does stuff, and no one has ever seen it since.
We watched that stage burn out. We watched the second stage burn out. We watched the third stage burn out. And into the frame came something else. It flew into the frame like this, and it shot a beam of light at the warhead, which is represented by my thumb here. Now, remember, all this stuff is flying at several thousand miles an hour. So this thing fires a beam of light at the warhead, hits it, and then this thing flies up like this. Meanwhile, we're all going like this, fires another beam of light, goes around like this, we're going like this, fires another beam of light, goes down like this, fires another beam of light, and then flies out the way it came in. And the warhead tumbles out of outer space. Now, I saw that. I don't give a goddamn what anybody else says about it. I saw that on film.